Listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the September Community IT Innovators webinar. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on developing your nonprofit IT budget. We always like to do a planning and budgeting webinar this time of year, since we know that many of you are in the process of preparing for your next fiscal year. My name is Johan Hammerstrom, and I will be the presenter of today's webinar. I am the president and CEO of Community IT, and I'm also the moderator for our webinar series. Before we begin, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about our company. Community IT is a 100% employee-owned company. Our team of almost 40 staff is dedicated to helping nonprofit organizations advance their missions through the effective use of technology. We're technology experts, and were recently named the top Washington, D.C.-based managed services provider by MSP Mentor. And this is our third year in a row of receiving that honor from MSP Mentor. So without further ado, let's get started on today's webinar. So today we're going to be talking about budgeting, how to put together an effective budget for a nonprofit organization. And the approach that we'd like to take, or that I'd like to take and share with you, is to think of budgeting as a process that you go through, or even a journey almost. Budgeting is also a framework, and an effective budget can be a tangible tool that can help organizations plan and prioritize their IT needs for a period of 1 to 5 years. It can be tempting to simply roll over the previous year's budget, or sketch out a few ideas or throw some numbers on a napkin and turn those in as the budget. But I believe that if the budgeting process is engaged in seriously, it can be a way of helping the organization plan more effectively around its IT. So the approach that we're going to discuss today is one that may be happening almost automatically at organizations with a mature budgeting and planning process. And if you're joining us from an organization that has a mature budgeting process, a lot of this might seem familiar to you. But for organizations that don't engage in IT planning, this process is actually a framework that can introduce planning through the budgeting process. So in some ways, the budgeting becomes a Trojan horse for developing an organizational IT plan. So let's start by reviewing the process, the basic overview. The first step in the budgeting process involves 3 tasks. First, you have to assess your network. You need to assess your current IT environment. IT should be evaluated on a regular basis. An annual review is ideal, although larger organizations that are using technology more strategically might benefit from more frequent assessments. Technology ages fairly quickly, more quickly I think than any of us want it to. For example, the expected lifespan of a well-used laptop is about 3 years. Technology also evolves rapidly, and we've seen a significant change in the nature of data breaches, for example, and hacking over the past year, so much so that an IT security plan and budget from 2015 is no longer really effective in 2017. So the rapid change of IT really requires an annual assessment, and the need to put together a budget every year is a great way of ensuring that you're assessing and evaluating your IT systems on an annual basis. It's also important to analyze and incorporate, where appropriate, last year's budget. Now, many organizations will roll their budgets over from year to year, and that can be effective, and there are certain aspects of that that are appropriate and helpful, and we'll talk through some of those considerations, as well as some of the pitfalls that can be associated with that approach. And finally, the larger business or strategic organizational plan needs to be considered. And that can also be a challenge. It's still the case today that many IT functions in an organization, whether a department or a team, are traditionally siloed off from the rest of the organization. IT often lacks effective representation at the executive level, and IT is not always collaborating with the rest of the organization, and the rest of the organization is not always collaborating with the IT function. Some of this is historical, and it can be hard to overcome the traditional culture of IT being siloed. That stereotypical Unfriendly IT tech locked away in the server room is becoming less and less common, but the cultural impact of that stereotype remains in a lot of organizations today. So we're going to spend quite a bit of time in this webinar talking about each of these three preparation activities: assessment, incorporating the previous budget, and looking at the business plan. And then we'll go through a specific and detailed framework for taking those three and putting them into a draft budget. We'll spend a lot of time talking about some of the key elements that you need to plan for in your draft budget. The draft budget should contain everything. Obviously, you're not going to get everything you want in a budget, but I feel it's vital to capture everything that you think the organization needs in that draft budget. And I would recommend saving a copy of the draft budget to feed into next year's budget. So you can go back to your leadership, for example, and say, well, we recommended getting a new backup system last year, and we took it out of the budget, but the need for it has grown only more so over the past year. We'd like to put it in this year's budget. So holding on to that draft budget in and of itself is a very effective mechanism for IT planning. And the next step then, once you have your draft budget and once you get your feedback from senior leadership, is to prioritize. Now, to be effective, prioritizing also requires collaboration with the rest of the organization, especially with senior leadership and other key stakeholders. And finally, once you've prioritized all of the items in your budget, then you have the finalized budget, which can now also serve as the basis for a plan, an IT plan for the coming year. Because a budget, this is important in my experience, a budget is a written statement of organizational commitment to specific investments, IT investments in this case, in the coming year. And the plan is the outline of when and how those investments will be made. So if you engage effectively in the budgeting process, what you're getting, hopefully, is a written commitment by the rest of the organization to make certain investments in IT in the coming year. And then you can take that budget and that written commitment and turn it into your own IT plan, which is really an outline of when and how those investments will be made. So let's look more closely into these 4 steps of the process. The first step is preparation. What do you need to do to prepare? How to be prepared? It starts, as I mentioned before, with an assessment. And the assessment should be relatively thorough. Now, the degree of thoroughness is going to depend on unique organizational factors. At the very least, it should involve some level of inventory. Now, for larger organizations, this is going to be a more complicated task, obviously. Larger organizations have a lot more data, have more applications that they're using, and have a lot more hardware. But organizations of all sizes should put together a pretty thorough inventory that lists out all of the data that they're using. It should be as broad as possible. So a data inventory would include such things as member information, where it's stored and who has access to it, electronic medical records, donor information, policy documents, planning documents. As much as possible, all of the data and information that the organization generates and uses should be captured in that inventory. It's also a good idea to inventory all of the applications being used by the organization. And this, of course, has become a lot more challenging over the past 5 years with the growth of what's commonly referred to as shadow IT. With the advent of the cloud and sort of the new approach in startup culture, it's much easier now for departments and individuals to go out and obtain applications and services without notifying their IT department. Dropbox is probably the most notorious example, and many organizations have staff who've set up their own Dropbox system to share and collaborate on documents. So it can be challenging to gather an exhaustive list of applications, but as part of preparing for the budget process, every effort should be made to be as thorough as possible. Finally, hardware needs to be inventoried. Every piece of equipment that you have, workstations, laptops, servers, switches, wireless access points, and so on, should all be gathered into a list, and you should include the age, purchase date, and the warranty status of that equipment. Budgeting also provides an opportunity to perform some basic risk analysis for the organization. Now, we've run a number of webinars over the past year or so that went into a lot more detail on the risks, particularly the security risks that nonprofit organizations are facing. So I won't dwell on those today. And if anyone is interested in learning more about analyzing and developing a business continuity plan or an IT security plan, I encourage you to go to our website and look at some of the previous webinars that we've offered on those topics. But budgeting provides a great opportunity for IT to have a conversation with senior leadership on business continuity requirements. Just some basic questions will really help in the budgeting process. How long can we afford to be without email? How long could we afford to be without our financial system? And here's where that inventory that you gathered with applications and data can come in handy. You can just add another column to that list and have your senior leadership identify maximum tolerances for downtime and data loss. On all of the data that you inventory, how many days or weeks or hours or minutes of data can you afford to lose? And then you want to think about the likelihood of those things happening based on your current system. So risk is always a combination of impact times likelihood. So clearly the impact of losing all of your email would be catastrophic for some organizations. The likelihood of an organization that's hosting its email in Office 365 is very, very low. So it doesn't present a great risk. If, however, that email is being hosted on an on-premise Exchange server that's running on hardware that's 7 or 8 years old, now the likelihood has gone up, and so has the risk. So that's an important exercise to go through. IT security in particular, in 2017, should be one of the most important things that people look at. So certain organizations, high-profile nonprofits, nonprofits working in dangerous environments, especially internationally, tend to have a very mature understanding of their security risks. Most organizations, however, tend to underestimate the risks that they face. Most small nonprofits don't consider themselves to be targets because of their size. And unfortunately, because of the nature of the internet, mobility, and software, it's now so easy for criminals to target organizations. It requires very little investment on their part to attack a large number of organizations. So if you have any internet footprint at all, then you are probably at risk. So advanced security readiness is something that organizations should be preparing for and something that they should be considering, as part of their IT budget for the coming year. Advanced security readiness requires a combination of increased management oversight, more advanced tools, well-defined IT policy, and staff training. Some combination of those 4 factors, increased management, more advanced tools, a well-defined IT security policy, and staff training, should be included in the budget. Finally, and most importantly, and I think this often gets overlooked by staff as they put together their IT budget, the budgeting season gives you a great opportunity to collect information from staff on their experience of IT. This is vital. If staff have a positive experience of IT, then it will make it easier for you to get the funding you need to ensure that the priorities that you have are included in the budget. And it will give you, and the more you can get your basic needs met in your budget, the more you'll be able to focus on more strategic initiatives. If the staff have a negative experience of IT, then it can also help make the case for certain key investments. So, for example, if your staff are complaining about the quality of their workstations, and you have those complaints and that feedback in an organized and methodical manner, you can present that to senior leadership to help make your case for replacing old workstations. There are a variety of ways to collect this information. Anecdotal feedback, especially from senior staff, especially in environments where the experience is not great, is probably forthcoming already. And you want to be diligent about collecting that feedback and also responding to it. And in fact, that can be a great way to show your responsiveness as an IT department. If you're taking the feedback from, especially your senior executives in the organization, if you're taking their feedback seriously and connecting the dots between your budget and their feedback, it can really help not only make them feel better that you're hearing them, but also help with selling the budget to the senior staff. Surveys can also be an effective tool. They should be short, ideally, and focused on specific aspects of the user experience. And in our experience, it's difficult to do surveys well. It's a real science. Clearly, it's something that it's a discipline that's been developed with great rigor over the last 100 years. And so for IT staff that don't have experience with conducting surveys, it can be hard to do them well. Ideally, you would get a third party to run the survey for you, either your HR department, which is hopefully conducting staff surveys on a regular basis, or someone outside the organization that is experienced in running surveys. And then finally, analyzing tickets, service tickets can be really helpful. It requires the IT department to classify the tickets, and that takes a little bit of work. And if that's not done, maybe the ticket list isn't as helpful. But you could also do sort of a scan of the tickets and see if you can just eyeball, especially for smaller networks, smaller organizations, eyeball the issues that seem to be recurring. So the user experience is an important, vital input into the budgeting process. I'm going to take a quick break to look at the questions here. We have one person who lost sound. I believe that everyone else is okay at the moment. Unfortunately for that person, hopefully they can dial back in. I'll just let them know that. Okay. So let's move on to the next item, which is previous budgets. And I actually wanted to talk about a couple different scenarios in case you're at an organization that doesn't have a budget. It exists, or no IT budget. Oftentimes there's no IT budget. Previous budgets should be looked at, and they often provide valuable information if they exist. But if there is no budget, even that fact in and of itself is valuable because it points to a lack of management and possibly even governance capacity in the organization. If there's no budget for IT, then it means that no one's been advocating for IT, and that really needs to become a top priority. A second possibility is that there was a budget, or there is some kind of IT budget, but that it's sort of dispersed throughout the rest of the organization's budget. So some aspects of IT show up in the finance section, some aspects show up in the programmatic line items, some show up under communications, and there may be good reasons for this, and I certainly don't mean this statement as universal, but in my experience, those sorts of budgets are not always effective for two reasons. First, it sort of assumes that other functional areas are qualified to make decisions about investing in technology. And that's possible, particularly if it's the communications department investing in the website. But in other cases, for example, having the program department invest in a program-focused database can be more difficult for them to make good decisions or to understand all the implications of the costs associated with that system. So it's possible but unlikely that every other department really has the skill and experience to put together an effective IT budget. And secondly, it makes it much harder to pursue initiatives that require a holistic view of IT. For example, data integration. Integrating the data across different systems is a priority for a lot of organizations. And if those systems are spread out throughout the budget and ownership of those systems is spread out throughout the organization, it can make integrating it more difficult. And more importantly, it can make effective security initiatives much more difficult. When you're talking about IT security, you're really looking at establishing security for all of the information systems in the organization. If the organization lacks a unified view into its technology and lacks a unified approach with its technology, it can make those sorts of initiatives difficult to pursue. Now, when you're carrying over items from last year's budget, be mindful of a few things. First, be mindful of cost increases. Two areas that almost always involve some form of cost increase are services, which we'll discuss in much greater detail when we get to the draft budget section, and costs related to changes in staff size, and we'll talk about that as well. And this is where understanding the organization's plan for the coming year is important. We'll get to that in just a second. Now, another gotcha when you're carrying over items from a previous year budget are multi-year costs. That is, IT costs that only occur every few years, but not every year. If those lines aren't included in the budget every year, they often get lost. So the classic example is DNS registration. That's usually a minor cost, although for organizations that have several dozen domain names, it can become a more significant cost. Typically, DNS registration happens every 3 to 5 years. So you'll have a cost in 1 year and you won't need that cost in there for another 3 or 4 years. But if you're not including that line item in your budget, it can sort of disappear, and then you're not budgeting for it the year when you need to renew those domain names. Hardware warranty renewals are another great example. So I strongly recommend leaving all of these in your budget during the off years. And here's where having that inventory of data, which should include your domain names and your workstations, becomes very helpful. Because if you have all of your workstations in that, and that inventory of when the warranties expire, then you can ensure that you're renewing them in the year where they expire. So let's talk about the third item that needs to be included in the preparation part of preparing the budget, and that's organizational planning. So organizational planning needs to be taken into account. Whoever is responsible for putting together the IT budget should be familiar with the broader strategic plans for the organization. In the very best situations, there's an IT-focused executive, either the CIO or the COO, who understands the needs of IT, or a CFO who understands the needs of IT, that's familiar with the broader strategic plans, that's had a seat at that senior leadership or executive table as those plans have been put together. At the very least, IT should be aware of the strategic plans and have some idea of how those plans will impact technology and will require technology to be supported. Specific changes that can have a significant impact on the IT budget include starting new initiatives or programs, as well as closing existing initiatives or programs. Starting and closing initiatives can mean adding new workstations, increasing the number of software licenses, rolling out new software applications, and onboarding more staff. All of those have IT-related costs associated with them. Closing down programs can also mean having to decommission hardware and archive data. New sites and locations, even if you're not adding new programs or initiatives, but you're just expanding the scope of the organization by opening new sites, or you're closing, you're shrinking the scope of the organization by closing sites, those can have a significant impact on the budget. Networking equipment, internet service, printing, site-to-site connections, all need to be taken into account. And finally, the funding changes or requirements can have an impact on the budget. So now that you've gone through the process of preparing and have gathered all of the information that you need, comes time to put together a draft budget. Typically, most organizations, most nonprofit organizations have to minimize overhead costs. So it's often useful to divide the budget into capital expenditures and operating expenditures. Capital expenditures are significant investments that have a multi-year impact and that can be depreciated on the balance sheet over time, while operating expenditures are expenditures that occur within a given year to benefit solely that given year. Now, the guidelines for what can be classified as a capital expenditure vary from organization to organization, and nonprofit organizations, in my experience, have widely different requirements about how much should be put under capital expenditures and how much should be put under operating expenditures. I would encourage you to discuss that with your finance and accounting department early on and to get a clear sense from them what their preference is and what the requirements are for putting things as capital expenditures. At the same time, many organizations also have rules regarding competitive bidding and will often require a more thorough competitive bid process on projects and expenditures over a certain amount. So sometimes you have to sort of thread the needle. You want to make sure that your project is over a certain amount to be considered a capital expenditure, but under a certain amount to avoid a laborious bidding process. Because of the variability of these requirements at different organizations, I won't go into the specifics here. But a general rule of thumb is that large projects are often considered capital expenses, and ongoing or maintenance support is usually considered operational. Now, many of you are familiar with the Gartner framework, Run, Grow, Transform, and I recently attended a nonprofit-focused webinar that modified that into Run, Scale, Transform. And that can be a useful framework. I decided not to emphasize it in this webinar, mostly because it's a good conceptual model, but when you get down to the practical parts of putting together a budget, I found that most small and medium-sized nonprofit organizations don't need it and don't find it that useful, practically speaking. For both capital and operating expenses, it's important to think about your IT in 4 different categories: personnel, hardware, software, and services. And so for every project, you can divide those project costs into these 4 categories. And for your ongoing expenses, you can divide those expenses into these 4 categories. Let's start with personnel. Personnel costs should include fully loaded staff costs for your staff. So that includes their salaries, benefits, taxes associated with those staff. It includes training materials that the staff need, ongoing professional development. That should all be included in personnel costs. If you're working with any third-party service providers, such as a managed service provider, those costs should be included in personnel costs as well. And finally, if you're planning on working with any external consultants, you should include those costs as labor or personnel costs. External consultants are particularly useful and common on projects, particularly if you're rolling out a new software solution. You'll often need to work with an external consultant to implement that solution effectively. Now we get to hardware. I put workstations down here 3 times just to emphasize the importance of including workstations in your annual budget. And there are a couple different considerations. There are a couple different approaches that organizations take to renewing their workstations. The preferred approach is a life cycle approach that basically involves replacing 1/4 to 1/3 of the workstations every year. And if you get on that cycle, then you don't have a situation where the workstations are getting very, very old throughout the organization and all have to be replaced at once, and it ends up being a huge expenditure and also a huge amount of work for the IT department. And by workstations, I mean desktops and laptops. So a gradual life cycle approach is important. The reason that I emphasize workstations 3 times is also because workstations, because they're a small cost and because they're only used by, each workstation is used by 1 staff person, they tend to be the first thing to go in an IT budget. And unfortunately, as workstations age, they become harder to use, they impact productivity, and they become more expensive to support. You want to make sure that you're including your servers, and this is a good time to just highlight the difference between virtual and physical servers. So physical servers are the actual box, the plastic, metal, and silicon that sits either in your closet, in your server room, in your data center that is running the software on top of it. Now, virtualization allows you to run multiple instances or multiple virtual servers on top of that 1 physical server. And it's possible to even migrate virtual servers from 1 physical server to another physical server. However, virtual servers also have aging associated with them based on the age of the operating system that they're running. So you wouldn't want to plan for simply porting your Windows 2003 server onto a new piece of hardware because Microsoft is no longer supporting that version of Windows Server. So it's important to plan for upgrades of both virtual servers and physical servers. I would recommend including both of them in the hardware category. Even though virtual servers are software, they're a foundational type of software that supports other applications. You want to make sure that you're including network equipment. Firewall needs to be upgraded typically every 5 years or so, mostly because firewall vendors will end of life their products after 5 years and will no longer provide firmware upgrades and patches for the firewalls. Because the firewall is a critical part of security, it's important that you maintain the firmware and software on it. The same is true with wireless routers, which can be a point of entry for hackers into the network. So it's important that wireless routers and access points also have both an active warranty associated with them, as well as get replaced every 5 years. Network switches, which are the devices that have all the cables sticking into them, which basically connect all of the different machines on the network. Network switches also need to be renewed generally every 5 to 7 years. One of the crazy things about switches is that when they start to go bad, they go bad in very strange and difficult to troubleshoot ways. And so staff will start to think that their workstation is acting up or that the internet connection is flaky, when in actuality the switch is going bad. So it's important to get ahead of that and not spend a lot of time with lost productivity or IT support costs and just replace your switches proactively. You want to make sure to include audio-visual costs. Audio-visual nowadays is probably the greatest source of frustration for us and our clients, for most nonprofit organizations. There's an expectation that audio-visual should work well, and that's sort of been promised to us by a lot of software providers, such as Microsoft with Skype for Business, or GoToMeeting, which I'm using to broadcast this webinar today. But unfortunately, the reality is that the audiovisual systems tend to be difficult to use, especially for non-technical staff. And to get a top-notch audiovisual system, you have to invest a significant amount of money. So the budget is, if you have staff that are understandably unhappy with the AV systems available to them, you want to address that issue as part of the budgeting process and get some quotes on, well, here's what it would cost to have this level of AV, here's what it would cost to have this level of AV. And I think staff will find that it's a lot more expensive to have high quality AV than they realize. Finally, I've included printers as hardware, but I would strongly encourage you to work with a managed print service provider for all of your printer needs, and not necessarily purchase a printer, but just hire someone to provide you with a printer on lease and then handle all of the servicing of that printer. Next, we have software, and a couple different categories of software that you should be thinking of when you put together your draft budget. First is traditional. I call it traditional, but maybe in many cases it's legacy. We're no longer really talking about the cloud as the next big thing. The cloud is essentially how software is delivered these days. However, there are still a few common and predominant software packages, such as Razor's Edge, that are still hosted on-premise. So you want to make sure you understand which of your software packages are hosted on-premise, which ones you've purchased licenses for, and whether those licenses need to be renewed or whether an upgrade needs to be purchased in the coming year. Then we have what I call SaaS licensed applications. So Microsoft and Adobe are the two most common examples. Traditionally, Microsoft would just sell you a license for Office. So back in the good old days, you would buy one license for Office 2007, and that gave you the option to install that application on one computer for one user. Now, Microsoft is shifting its licensing model so that now they're moving towards a model where you buy a cloud-based user license. And this is included in the Office 365 E3 package. It can be an add-on to the E1 package through something called Pro Plus. And it gives you the ability to access Office from up to 5 devices. So if you purchase a license for someone, they can access Office on their home computer, they can access it on their work computer, they can access it on their iPad. And Adobe has a similar licensing model with Creative Cloud. The downside is you do not own these licenses in perpetuity, but you have to pay generally an annual or monthly subscription. And so you want to make sure that that's included in your budget. Then we have strict software as a service. So it's not an application that runs on your desktop like Office or Adobe Creative Suite. It's an actual web-based application that you only use in the web. So Office 365 is a good example of this. Salesforce is the classic example and was sort of the original software as a service system. A lot of IT departments now use ticketing systems that are cloud-based software as a service. Others could include Google Analytics. So your organization may be using Google Analytics or AdWords. Google has a great program for providing a certain amount of AdWords to nonprofit organizations. But I would still, even if you're not paying anything for it, I would include it in the budget with a cost of 0. So it shows up there. And then finally, you want to make sure you understand the shadow IT that's being used throughout the organization. Common ones include Basecamp and Slack. And again, with Slack in particular, it may not be something that the organization is paying anything for, but you want to make sure you're aware of it and that you include it in your IT budget. And this actually becomes, going back to the preparation phase, Basecamp is a good example. It's a project management software as a service application that is very popular among web developers. So your communications department may be using the free tier of Basecamp, which allows, I believe, up to 10 projects to collaborate with other people on developing websites or doing other projects and initiatives. And that's fine. I would go ahead and put it in your budget, but I would also engage in a conversation with the communications department and find out if they plan on expanding the number of projects they intend to use in Basecamp. Because if they want to use more than 10 projects, it's going to cost a little bit. It's a modest fee, but it's something that you want to have in your budget. So those are software costs. And finally, you have services costs. And you want to make sure that you're including these in the budget as well. These tend to carry over fairly well. So you have the internet service. As part of your assessment of the network, you may determine that you only have one internet connection. As part of that discussion that you're having with senior leadership about business continuity requirements, it may turn out that senior leadership really would prefer to have a redundant internet connection. So maybe that's an additional item that you're now including in your budget under services. Telephony systems, voice over IP, those would show up in services. Printers, as I mentioned before, typically are better to have as a service. For smaller organizations, you can purchase a printer and use it for a small office. It can be effective, but for larger organizations that are printing off lots of material, you're much better off having a managed print service, so you have someone else to maintain that equipment. Backup has become a service. So traditionally, backup was something that ran onto those tapes that you ended up taking home at night, taking home over the weekend. And backup, that was a very inefficient and unreliable form of backup. And in the last 5 years, the most reliable and robust backup systems are all backing data up to the cloud. And that has a service associated with it. And this is where understanding the organization's plans is important as well, because a lot of backup services are based on the amount of data that you're backing up. And so if you're anticipating that that will go up or increase in the coming year, you want to make sure that you're accounting for that in your backup line item. And then finally, security services, your antivirus, threat prevention, spam and content filtering. Chances are those might not be in your budget now. I would definitely include those in the draft budget. And even if you're unable to add them for 2018, for your upcoming fiscal year, you at least have it there and can start to bring that up over and over again with your senior leadership. So those are the 4 main categories that are helpful to think about when putting together your draft budget. Oh, two more. I was like, and even I forgot about them. The reason I put them on a separate slide is because people often forget about them, and I forgot about them myself. One is hardware recycling and data destruction. The sad fact is that computer equipment is in many ways toxic to the environment, and it's important that it be disposed of in an environmentally responsible manner. And there are a lot of companies now that will combine both hardware recycling and data destruction. And I think the worst case scenario, and unfortunately this happens all too often, is that your computers will get taken, they'll get shipped off to China, where the hard drives will get removed and people will try to obtain data from them, and then the rest of the materials will get sent and oftentimes will, for example, circuit boards will get burned in open air, burning so that the precious metals get melted down. But that puts a lot of toxins in the environment. Oftentimes, children are involved in that process, and it has a negative impact on their health. So it's important that you find a reputable hardware recycling and data destruction provider, and to do it right is going to cost money. So you want to include that in your budget as well. And finally, your website. Oftentimes, that's something that the communications department will set up, but that'll move over into the IT budget at some point. So you'll want to be aware of that, along with security certificates, your SSL certificates. Those are kind of like DNS, domain name registration, something that sort of gets forgotten. Okay, the two forgotten items. I'm glad I put that slide in here. And finally, just as another reminder, leave $0 in the budget. Now you're kind of looking at the budget as both a budget and a plan. But if you have any items that you're not paying for this year, or Microsoft's E1 licenses, you're getting them for free as a nonprofit organization, I would still put that in the budget and put $0 there. So this is an illustration of what your budget might look like. It's got the two large categories of capital expenditures and general operating costs. Each of those is divided up into a mix of labor or personnel costs. Got services costs down here at the bottom. You're basically just sort of categorizing you're taking that inventory that you put together in the preparation phase and you're categorizing it in a way that makes sense. And then you're identifying costs associated with it. And then ideally you're planning out 3 to 5 years in advance. And if you can put together a 5-year budget, you're really going to be able to capture all of the sort of the total IT costs that the organization is going to face. And that can be helpful when we talk about our next section. I got to zoom here just in case you want to see anything more closely. Prioritizing. The chances are that you're not going to get everything you ask for in your IT budget. And so you're going to have to prioritize. And the question is, how do you prioritize? What do you do to prioritize? So this is kind of in reverse order, but I wanted to use kind of Maslow's hierarchy of needs and present it as a pyramid of capacity that you're building up in terms of your IT systems. And at the base is the hardware refresh. And unfortunately, this is something that organizations are tempted to skimp on because it's expensive and because it happens more often than people want it to, and because the current hardware is still working. But if you continually kick the can down the road, so to speak, on the hardware refresh, it's going to catch up with you. And when it does, it's going to be very unpleasant and it's going to become a lot more expensive. So I would prioritize replacing the workstations, getting rid of those old servers, and really focusing on making sure that your hardware is in good shape. And that's another reason why the 5-year plan can be really helpful. The second priority would be the existing licenses. Those, you've got to maintain in order to continue to function as an organization. And then finally, any new initiatives that you're adding. In terms of the hardware, the most important are switches and the wireless. If the switch goes bad, it affects everyone. Same with the server. If the server goes bad, everyone is affected. Workstations as a whole affect a lot of people. But if you have really hard choices to make in putting your budget together, I would not put off replacing the switches in favor of replacing all the workstations. You want to make sure that you're not letting your switches and your wireless equipment get too old. You want to make sure that your backup system is running effectively. And finally, you want to make sure you have good security in place. So a helpful graphic for looking at your prioritization could be this prioritization matrix, which maps urgency along one axis and importance along another axis. And then the size of the circle, the area of the circle, is the amount of time or effort or cost required to do the initiative. And so you can put together, in Excel, this is all done in Excel, you can put together all of the initiatives. You can take that budget that I just showed you and list it out here, and then assign a score for importance and urgency to each item, as well as either the amount of time you think it'll take or the cost of it. And then you can map that on this chart. And clearly the things that show up in the upper Gartner's Magic Third Quadrant are the things that you absolutely have to do, and the things that are down at the other end are things that might get put off for another year. So that can be a useful tool for prioritizing, and those are some guidelines that I would encourage you to have for prioritizing. So hopefully, after you've gone through this whole process, you've prioritized some of the things you've had to take out of the budget. Most of the things that you need to be able to do are still in the budget. Now you have the budget as a plan, and you can take that budget and start to add a timeline to it. So that budget that I showed you before that lists, pull that back up, all of the different expenditures and the costs associated with them, you can take those first three columns of this Excel spreadsheet and put it on another tab, and then add months across for the remaining columns. And you can identify when you want to do these projects. And now you've taken your budget and turned it into a plan. And that's important because every IT department has finite capacity, and more importantly, your organization has finite capacity for technology change. So you don't want to do all of your projects at once. Not only will it stress you out as an IT department, but it will stress your staff out because they don't want to have to deal with new server, new workstation, new wireless, new email system, new time entry system all at the same time. Those need to be spread out. And you need to plan around other major events in the life of the organization, such as galas, fundraising events, board meetings, and major programmatic activity. But if you take those things into account, this approach to budgeting really gives you a great tool for turning that budget into a plan. All right, well, that concludes the main portion of this webinar. We have about 10 minutes remaining, which I will use for Q&A. Before I get to that, I did want to highlight our webinar next month, the latest in Office 365. So we are ourselves technology agnostic, but Microsoft remains the 800-pound gorilla in the IT space, and most nonprofit organizations that we work with are using Office 365, at the very least for email, but many organizations are starting to use OneDrive, Skype for Business. It does seem like every month or two, and I'm not even joking about that, Microsoft is coming out with some new service or feature in Office 365. So we're going to look at some of the lesser well-known features next month, such as Planner, Power BI, which is a data visualization tool that's pretty amazing. I just got an email from Microsoft yesterday called My Analytics, and it told me how much time I spent on email, who I was emailing the most with. It was almost like Microsoft was telling me how productive or non-productive I had been over the past month. I hadn't asked for it. I was a little interested and curious in it when I got it. I'm definitely curious to find out more about what it is and where it came from. And those are exactly the kinds of things we're going to be looking at in our webinar next month. So we definitely hope you can join us for that. So let's get some questions. All right. This is a great question. And I encourage everyone to go ahead and shoot these sort of organization specific questions to me. This was a general webinar, but I would love to take the last 10 minutes here to answer some specific questions or address specific situations that you're facing. So in this case, this organization doesn't have a firewall. They don't have any servers or network set up beyond a basic wireless network. Should they look into getting a hardware firewall, or is that more necessary when you have a robust internal network? That's a great question. That is an issue that our guidelines have changed on over the last 4 or 5 years. We originally were pretty adamant about every organization needs a firewall. We've now shifted our position a little bit. And if all you have is a basic wireless network, you're not hosting any data, then the firewall that's included with your internet router is probably sufficient. If you're not hosting anything and and the firewall that's included with your internet router is set up properly, then it's probably sufficient. The corollary of this is kind of a new heuristic, let's call it, that we've adopted in the IT space over the last year or two, and that is the endpoint is the perimeter. The endpoint is the perimeter. And what that means is all of the firewalling and protection that used to happen at the point of entry into the organization, where the local area network sort of met the public internet, we used to consider that the perimeter. And we had a lot of protections like firewalls in place to stop hacking attempts at that point. Well, the perimeter is now the endpoint. By endpoint, we mean workstation or laptop. That's because people are taking their laptops home with them, connecting to that wireless network. They're taking them to the airport. They're taking them to the coffee shop. And so those devices are going all over the place. And so the protection that we used to have at the local area network perimeter now needs to be on the laptop. So that's the main reason why it's not as important to have a firewall on the outside of the network. Now, if you are hosting data, if you have servers, if you need to allow some kind of access into the network, then a firewall is still pretty critical and important. Another question, how is shadow IT different from software as a service? So typically shadow IT is a form of software as a service. So software as a service is software that's provided to you typically through the web. Sometimes there's a mobile app associated with that software, but you don't own a license. You're paying a subscription to use that service on a monthly or annual basis. Shadow IT is software or actually more broadly, it's IT systems that are being used by staff to store and manage organizational information without the knowledge of the IT department. And so if the fundraising team is planning an event and they set up their own personal Dropbox account and they use it to store all of the documents that are associated with planning this event, that is a form of shadow IT because it's outside of the purview of the IT department. And this is a problem because if those staff leave the organization, then the knowledge of that information is going with them. Let's say they're collecting a membership list for that event. They're collecting a list of people who are going to attend the event. Well, if they all leave and take that Dropbox account with them, the organization has now lost all of that information. More importantly, Dropbox has been known to be hacked. And so if their account gets hacked or if they have poor security in place, now they've exposed contact information that was collected ostensibly by the organization for its own business. They've now exposed that to the outside world. That's an organizational liability. So shadow IT is, I don't want to overplay it, but it can be a serious problem. And In defense of staff, it typically arises when staff are not getting the support that they need from the IT department. So we see Dropbox used most often when the only other option staff have is an old file server that they can't access outside of the local area network, and that they're unable to share files from to external collaborators. So it just highlights the importance of the IT department working actively to collaborate with the rest of the organization. Okay. Oh, yes. Thank you very much. This webinar is being recorded and it will be posted to our YouTube channel. So all of our webinars, we now have 50 or 60 webinars, are all available on our YouTube channel. You can also find links to them on our website, and we post all of the PowerPoint slides associated with these webinars to our SlideShare account. So every one of you who's registered for this webinar will be receiving an email from us with links to those locations. But you can also just go to youtube.com/communityit, and that'll take you to our channel. Thank you for asking that. I should have mentioned that. Great. Oh, this is a good question. I might go a little bit over 5, just fair warning. How do you perceive cross-departmental costs, such as donation processing fees / licensing for donation processing websites? This organization uses several online portals for accepting donations depending on the campaign. And while they are internet licenses, they tend to budget them with fundraising costs in the development department. Is there a best practice for categorizing these costs? I would say that I've seen it done both ways, and it's a gray area. This is a great example because it's a gray area, and it kind of depends on, I think so the point that I made earlier about IT costs being dispersed throughout the budget and throughout the organization is about sort of the ownership of those systems. And the risk that organizations run when those costs are too dispersed is that no one owns the system. So I saw a case where there was a project. An organization built sort of a microsite. They built one of these. It was a $5,000 mini website for a single initiative that they were running. And the web developer decided they wanted to build it in Amazon Web Services. And so it was built. The payment for Amazon Web Services was all handled by the communications department. They never told IT. And then once actually, no, I'm sorry, it was handled by the program department. And then when the program was over, they moved on. They had other programmatic priorities. Well, no one ever paid the bill, and so Amazon turned off the site, and the website was lost. And 6 months later, someone else needed access to it because there was some valuable information on that site. And unfortunately, there was no way to recover it. So that was a case where the programmatic department isn't really thinking about the information as information. They're thinking about it as a tool for fulfilling the programmatic needs of the organization, which is absolutely right. That's their responsibility. But the IT department is going to look at that and say, if we shut it down, we may lose the information. Let's check with everyone else in the organization to make sure that that information is safeguarded, that it's protected. So in that case, it was a cost that should have been owned and managed by the IT department because there was mission critical information associated with it. Now, in this case, these licenses for these internet licenses for accepting donations, this is more of a transactional cost, or this is a cost associated with a transaction, and there may not be any information involved. And so I think it's, in this case, a little bit more appropriate for it to be a development cost because it's sort of on par with, back in the day when people did direct mailings, the costs associated with postage for direct mailing would probably be borne not by the overhead postage costs of the organization, but those would be allocated to fundraising because they were sort of a direct variable cost dependent upon fundraising activity. So I could see how this, in this case, this is a transactional cost associated with the direct fundraising activity of that department. And if there's no information involved, then then I think this makes sense to me in this case, the way that you're currently doing it. But I think the litmus test, if you will, is the whether or not information is involved in the transaction. And if there is information involved, or the storage of information, then then it becomes something that you definitely want to talk through with the IT department. All right. Hey, it's 5 o'clock. Thank you all for joining us today. It's a real pleasure for me. Maybe it's a bad time. I don't know. I love budgeting. I think IT budgeting is one of the best things an organization can do, and I really enjoy talking about it. And I really appreciated these questions. They've been great. Thank you all so much for your attention. Have a great day. Please check out our other webinars at our website, and please join us next month for a deeper dive into what's new with Office 365. Take care.